Hello, welcome to From Caracas. I'm Laura Prada. In this opportunity, we'll be talking with Donald Foreman, who is a member of the Canadian Postal Union Workers, and he is part of this international solidarity group who is in Venezuela and who's sharing with postal unions also here in Venezuela, and with whom we'll be talking about trade unions, about solidarity, and of course, about Venezuela. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please, which points in common have you found with the Venezuelan postal unions?
The main point we find in common is the solidarity aspect between postal workers. Whether you're working for the post office in Canada or you're working for the post office in Venezuela, the job is the same. So we have a lot of mutually in common things that we do. So it's easy to start a conversation.
Why coming to Venezuela? Why working with postal unions here also in Venezuela?
Well, our main goal here in Venezuela is to develop a project with the postal workers here in Venezuela. We're developing a financial project similar to one we have with other unions in Colombia and Cuba and other places in the world to help financially assist the Venezuelan postal workers to build a strong trade union movement within the post office.
But you've been more than this time in Venezuela. You were also here last year when the presidential elections took place in the month of May. What difference have you been able to see in this time, in this visit?
Not a lot of difference, really. I mean, it's surprising. We hear a lot in the Canadian media about, all these troubles in Venezuela and how, people are literally starving on the streets. But when you walk the streets of Venezuela, you just don't see what you're hearing in Canada.
There is an international campaign to discredit Venezuela and the Venezuelan government. What kind of things do they say about Venezuela that Canadian people sometimes ask, what is happening actually in Venezuela?
Well, it's constant, from the brutal dictatorship to people fleeing the country en masse, to people starving and eating out of the garbage, to every day there's a different news story that runs on a crisis in Venezuela. And that's why it's important for unions to come here and see what's actually happening with our own eyes and not listen to the corporate media that's being reported in Canada.
And what do you tell those people who are close to you or who are friends or just people that you know and you meet and they hear that you were in Venezuela? What do you tell them? What do you tell those people that sometimes believe that media campaign and who don't seek more information about what is really happening in Venezuela?
I tell them the truth. I mean, I walk around Venezuela freely. I've been to 3 different states in Venezuela. I've met with people all over the place. I'm not repressed. I don't see a dictatorship. I don't see military all over the streets. I don't see all of this stuff happening that we're told that's happening. There, you definitely can tell that there's an economic crisis here. Even my money doesn't go as far as it used to go in Venezuela. There's no doubt that people are suffering financially. There's no doubt that the blockade from the U.S. has added a lot of problems to Venezuela. But the humanitarian crisis of people eating out of the garbage and people dying on the streets and homeless and fleeing en masse is something I just haven't seen with my own eyes here in Venezuela.
Talking about Venezuela, I want you to tell me a little bit about that experience you lived last year when you were part of the observing members that came to observe the elections on May, the presidential elections.
It was very important to us as a social group. We came with what's called Common Frontiers, which was we're all Venezuelan group made up of the United Church, trade unions, and social activist groups that came in Venezuela, because the early reports in Canada was the election was a fraud. There was no legitimacy to any election that was going to take place in Venezuela. So we found it important to come with our own eyes and actually witness the process and how Venezuelans vote, how they go to the polls, and how everything works in Venezuela compared to what we were being told in Canada. I mean, we are very well aware that the opposition had won an election in 2015 here in Venezuela, and all of a sudden by 2018, everything was corrupt and you couldn't have a fair election here in Venezuela. It didn't make sense, so we had to come and see it for our own eyes.
And what you found when you came and you watched it with your same eyes, you saw there was no corruption, there was just a country following its path. What you found? What was that? What did you realize when you came and you were part of that group?
Well, it's obvious that there's a campaign against Venezuela to discredit every part of Venezuela, and especially to discredit the legitimate government that's been elected in Venezuela. The opposition's very active in Canada. They lobby our MPs, they tell one side of a story, and it's all pushed one side of a story. There is no reporting on another side of the story. I mean, even to this day, you'll see Juan Guaidó having rallies in the street, but you won't see any of the rallies of the government in the streets. They won't show you that in the media. They'll only show you one side of a story. So it's always important for people to come and see with their own eyes, and that's what I tell other Canadians. Go there, have a look, talk to the people of Venezuela, and ask them what their opinion is of everything in Venezuela. And I know the people I talk to in Venezuela, they don't give me the same story I get when I'm in Canada.
And about that electoral system, what did you found something new? Did you discover something new? Did you find something? Because you know the electoral system, the Venezuelan electoral system is said that is one of the best in the world. Well, were you able to check that?
Yeah, I found it actually quite incredible, the election system in here in Venezuela. I mean, you actually need a fingerprint to vote. So I found it hard to believe that there was such fraud going on in an election, you know, as if they're cutting off people's fingers and using them to vote. You know, you actually have to have a fingerprint. We don't need a fingerprint in Canada to vote. I just have to show up with my driver's license and I can go vote. Here in Venezuela, you're required a government ID, you're required a fingerprint, and then you can cast your ballot. And we went to probably 6 different polling stations on that day, and we didn't see anything out of the normal at all. People were lined up orderly, people were going into the polls, people were voting on normal. There was no police blocking people or no obstructions at all to people coming out and using their democratic will to vote for any candidate they wanted to.
Since President Maduro was re-elected for a second term in office, and when he assumed this second term, there have been this international campaign, this self-named president, and all this international campaign, humanitarian aid, etc., etc., etc. Numerous countries, maybe a dozen countries, have said they are supportive of that self-named president. And Canada has been one of those countries. They've even closed some parts of its embassy here in Venezuela. Why is that? Why Canada assumed that position?
I mean, I could guess a lot of reasons. I think the main reason is Canada's interest in minerals, mining, and oil in Latin America. I mean, you know, we have a lot of business in Colombia, we have a lot of business in Honduras, and Canadian mining companies want their share of Venezuela. We don't seem to care about problems in Honduras or trade unionists being killed in Colombia or other problems in Brazil with poor people being killed, but you know, the Canadian government is solely focused on Venezuela. That's all they talk about. We lead the Lima group, which was surprising because the Canadian government should be operating, as we always have, within the structures of the OAS and within the structures of the United Nations. They couldn't get the support at either of those organizations, so they went and created their own group of the Lima group. And the misinformation that comes out of this is quite spectacular, and it's unusual for Canada. I mean, with Cuba, we've had 59 years of diplomatic relations, regardless of what the U.S. policy is. All of a sudden, we're doing everything that the U.S. wants us to do. I kind of think, you know, there's something bigger going on. Maybe it had to do with the free trade deal between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, that Canada took a stronger role to appease the Trump administration. We're really quite confused as to why our Liberal government in Canada has taken such a strong stance against Venezuela and have no open dialogue. There's no room to talk, there's no communication, embassies have been closed in both countries, and that's unusual for Canada. We used to be a diplomatic country, and we've become one of more of aggression, which to me as a Canadian is unsettling. I don't like it.
But we've seen that in the recent times, not only you were talking about the example, you were putting as an example Cuba, but we've seen in the last months that the Canadian government has closed their posts also in Havana, their consular services, and they closed it also here in Venezuela. Is that Canada is against the wall? It's being put against the wall by United States?
We can only assume that the government hasn't really released a real good statement on the closure of the embassy in Havana, other than people got sick. And you know, as Canadians, we find it very strange that only Canadians and Americans got sick in embassies. No other country had any of these problems. And I'm not saying people didn't get sick, but to blame the Cuban government for the fact and to shut down an embassy, 1.5 million Canadians travel to Cuba every year as tourists. Mm-hmm. We've always had good relationships with Cuba. So I think it's got more to do with, you know, in the American media, you're constantly hearing that Cuba's propping up Venezuela and that there's this big thing between the two countries. So I think politically it just looked good for Canada to shut down that embassy, now forcing Cubans to either go to Mexico or Trinidad and Tobago if they need to come to Canada, which, as we all know, most Cubans can't afford to do that. You know, we recently had a national convention in Canada where we invited international guests. We invited Colombia, Brazil, European countries, we invited Cuba, and we invited Venezuela, Postal Union National President. The only one that had a visa turned down, and we even had the president of the Palestinian Postal Union in Canada, and the only one was turned down for a visa, and that was the Venezuelan national president of the post office here. For some reason, his visa was denied and he wasn't allowed entry into Canada. And we found that shocking, considering how many people we had invited, and we've never had a problem, and all of a sudden the visa was denied to enter Canada.
You've been trade unionist for more than 30 years.
Correct.
In these 30 years of you being an activist of this trade union activist, what changes have you seen in the way in which trade unionists are treated in the world? And specifically, I'm making you the question because of what is happening today in Latin America.
Oh, it's gotten so hard for unions to actually gain any type of benefits for their workers anymore. The governments have completely, you know, it's like an outright attack on trade unions. It's not, you know, I mean, when you look around the world, a lot of conservative and right-wing governments have been elected. And all of a sudden there's this outright attack on workers and to push workers down. Even in Canada, you know, we recently had negotiations with the Canada Post in Canada. And we ended up going on strike because we couldn't get an agreement on a contract. And we were only on strike a short period of time, and we were using what's called rotating strikes, where we're only taking one group of people out for one day and they were going back to work. And all of a sudden the Canadian government took away our right to strike, which is our legal right under the Constitution and under the Charter of Rights, that we have the right to strike. They took it away from us and they ordered us to go back to work, and they put what's called an arbitrator in to decide how our negotiations are going to go. And that, to me, you know, we no longer have democracy once we start losing our rights as trade unionists.
I became to talk to you about trade unionists because in Latin America in recent years, for example, specifically in Colombia, after the signing of the peace agreement in 2016, there have been a series of all time we are listening the news that a new trade unionist leader is being killed, a social leader is being killed in Colombia. Why, in Honduras, the teachers, the doctors, why are trade unionists being chased in that way in Latin America or in the world?
I don't have an answer for that outside of greed and capitalism. I mean, the rich are trying to make sure that workers don't get their foot in the ground, and that's what's so upsetting to me as a worker when I hear my government talk about human rights and I hear them talk about Venezuela, and right next door you have Colombia, which is probably the most dangerous place in the world to be a trade unionist. I was on the airplane coming here and the gentleman beside me said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "To Venezuela." And he says, "Venezuela?" He said, "That's dangerous." And I said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Colombia." And I said, well, it's much more dangerous as me as a trade unionist to go to Colombia than it would be to go to Venezuela. I'd be risking my life in Colombia. We just had several Colombian trade unionists in Canada that have fled because of death threats. And yet the Canadian government says nothing. And to me, that's a crime. What happens in Colombia to trade unionists and to social activists should be all over every newspaper. Yet it's quiet. We want to talk about Venezuela, Venezuela, Venezuela. We already have our mining companies in Colombia, so we're not going to criticize them. What we want, as I said, as a Canadian, it's so obvious to me what our government is gearing for. They want a new government in Venezuela. They want one that's ready to do business with the Canadian companies, not one that's going to put up roadblocks and say, you can come to Venezuela, but you're going to pay a price before you take our resources out, and it's going to be a fair price, and you're not going to abuse our workers. Business doesn't want that.
If you're not giving me a share, then I have nothing to do with you. That's
Exactly.
kind of what is happening.
Yes.
Okay. What's the deal with workers then? Why have workers become so dangerous? Trade unions become so dangerous for threats to governments.
Well, we're infringing on people's profits. We're asking for a piece of the pie. We're asking them to share the resources with workers, and to the global sort of entrepreneurs and the business people of the world, they don't want to share with us. They want cheap labor. You look in the U.S., you look in Canada, most of our good jobs have gone overseas to India, to China, to other places because it's cheap labor. Not because they make a better product, but because they can get it produced cheaper there and there's no labor rights. So this is what companies are gearing for. They just want to take away all of the rights of all of the workers. And that's why international solidarity work is so important. Workers need to start standing up for themselves everywhere and pushing back against the governments. We've seen that in France. We've seen it in other European countries. It needs to spread into North America, especially. The United States unions have been almost decimated. In Canada, it's getting worse every day for us. But we have to unite as workers everywhere and push back against this system.
From this, I have two questions. The first one, isn't it because governments don't want to, why governments don't want to share with the people that workers and trade unions have become dangerous, a threat to them? And maybe that has something to do with the war that is facing Venezuela, because the Venezuelan government works together with the trade unions in order that they all have to share the saying upon those resources?
Absolutely. I mean, it would be a dream of any worker in Canada to actually have a worker as a president. Venezuela has a worker as a president, has a union person as a president. Donald Trump is the president of the United States. This is a businessman. This is a billionaire. What does he have in common with any worker who makes up 80% of the population? They have nothing in common with each other. They're business people. They don't go into politics because it's a passion. They go into it to improve their business standing or to improve their friends in business standing. We all know in North America especially, businesses elect governments. They put the money into the campaigns. They get governments elected. And they do that so that governments pass laws that favor business, not the workers.
And my other question, of course, I have to say, yes, it's true that Venezuela, because also Venezuela has a trade unionist as head of government, that is also seen as a threat because he knows of those fights also. Indeed. My other question is about the Yellow Vest movement in France. You were talking about France before. Why has the world the world is not, the mass media in the world, the great consortiums, transnational consortiums, they are not paying that attention, the attention they should be paying to those protests? What are they demanding?
They're demanding the share of the pie. They want pensions, they want benefits, and they want a good working life for people. People want to be able to go to work, come home, and be able to take care of their families and to live. That's all workers really want. We're not asking to live in mansions or to fly in private jets. So the Yellow Vest movement, it's not covered because they don't want it to spread. They show little bits of it, and you get it in social media. But if they were to start showing this constantly on Canadian news and in American news, these things tend to spread. And so news media is not going to cover it. The last thing news media wants to do is to get Canadian workers actually angry and to the streets and against the government. I mean, I hope in my lifetime I would see a revolution as a worker in Canada. I'm getting up to the retirement age and I'm probably not going to see one. But I know now that, you know, my parents always wanted a better life for me. That's what they worked hard for. I can't tell my children now that they're going to have a better life. I had a better life than my parents, but things have changed now. You know, things are more expensive. There's no benefits. There's a lot of temporary work and precarious work. I can no longer say to my children, you're going to have a better life.
Why is not that possible? Why can't you're not able to tell that to your children?
Because the job market's changed. You know, it's not, and unions have lost a lot of
Due
powers.
to what?
Due to corporate interests. You know, they would rather have disposable employees that are precarious work, where they can use them when they need them, let them go when they don't. They don't want to pay benefits, they don't want to pay pensions, and they definitely don't want unions, because unions cost an employer money. So there's a huge push to make sure that companies can't unionize. A lot of the American companies that move into Canada have policies against unions. Amazon's moving in. They're, you know, I'm a postal worker. They're a huge threat to the postal business, and they will fight tooth and nail to make sure we can't unionize their workers. But we're going to do our best to try, because it's the only way to stop this, is by organizing all workers globally to push back against this trend.
Is there a real threat to postal workers with that? Enterprises like Amazon?
A huge threat. I mean, UPS, DHL, Amazon, they're all out there to make a lot of money. The postal service in Canada is a public postal service. So we deliver at cheaper rates, we deliver better, and we do a better job. They want that market. They want what we have, and they want it at a cheaper price, and they want to pay workers cheaper, and they definitely don't want a union involved. I mean, I think the Bezos, the president of Amazon, he's worth, you know, what is it, close to $1 trillion? I think when he got divorced, he had to give his wife $500 billion. That's ridiculous. You know, no human being needs that much money to live. I'm not against free market and people making money, but at what cost, and how rich do you have to be and not pay your workers? To me, that's a crime to not pay your workers a decent salary when you're making that much money.
And what actions are trade unions taking in order to fight back those actions that governments are taking, the enterprises that want to take positions of the workers?
In Canada, currently, not enough. We're not doing enough. You know, the governments and business have done a lot of work to make the unions a bureaucracy over the years, where there's, you know, between labor leaders and workers, there's a different lifestyle, there's a different wage, there's a different sort of thing. You know, it's got to come from new workers, young workers, that actually take back their power and start fighting for it. And the unions have to do a lot more. I mean, we lived a good life. I'll retire with some half-decent benefits and a pension. We need to fight for the younger kids, that they're going to have the same, just like our parents fought for us. And that's missing in the trade unions, unfortunately, in Canada right now, where we need to take to the streets more, we need to put more pressure on the government, and we need to unite as a labor body, not fight against each other. And currently we're not seeing it, but we need to. It has to get stronger, or else it's only going to get worse for us.
Thank you, Donald.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Love to. Thank you.
Like this, we come to the end of this From Caracas, where we spoke with Donald Foreman, who is an activist from the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. He is part of its International Solidarity Group. So with him, we've been talking today about the place where trade unions must be, the place of workers, but also about Venezuela and their relations. Thank you very much for being with us in this From Caracas. Thank you to you again, Don.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the best content in spaces where you will discover new perspectives, innovation,